أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وعظيمنا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد. وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المكرمين المنتجبين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيتها النفس المطمئنة ارجعي إلى ربك راضية مرضية فادخلي في عبادي وادخلي جنتي. صدق الله العلي العظيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. We began our discussion a few nights ago talking about the concept of rights within Islam. We spoke about some of the historical aspects and some of the philosophical aspects regarding rights. And then we spoke about the greatest right of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is His right to worship. Now, Imam Zayn al-Abidin, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, in Risalatul Huquq, which is the spine of the remainder of the talks, inshallah, he has a very particular order of rights that he puts forward. He starts first with the greatest right of Allah, for all rights ultimately belong to Him. Then he moves onto the rights of the nafs, rights of the self, rights of our body. Because that will then be the instrument through which we go to the next set of rights, which is the rights of how we use our body and ourselves, first in relation to Allah, and then second in relation to everybody else. It's a logical progression. So what is the right of the self, of the nafs, as per our fourth imam? He says, and the right of yourself incumbent upon you is that you employ it in obeying God, and then you deliver to your tongue its right, your hearing its right, your sight its right, your eye, your hand its right, your leg its right, your stomach its right, your private parts their right, and you seek help from God in all of that. And the ultimate right of the self, as the Imam is telling us here, it is what? It is to get salvation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has created us, as He told us in that verse that we spoke about yesterday, in Surah Al-Dhariyat, verse number 56, مَا خَلَقْنَا الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, that I didn't create jinn or mankind except that they may worship me. And we talked a little bit about worship, what it meant. That it's not just the ritual aspects of prayer, but also the acts of obeying God as well. And the ultimate right of the nafs is its own salvation. And all of the other rights that we have, they fall in the template of helping us to fulfill that right. When we talk about the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we recognize that the right of Allah is the door to Jannah. When we talk about the rights of the body, we talk about the instruments that we have and how we use them for good. Even when we talk about the rights of other people, we talk about it in two contexts. One, of course, in the fact that they are their own persons and we have to respect them, but also because they underlie the context of our lives. Many aspects of the tests that we face and the challenges we have when fulfilling rights come as a result of those who are around us. So the ultimate right of the nafs, it is for salvation. But what is the nafs? What is the self from an Islamic concept? Imam Ali salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, he says in a beautiful tradition recorded in Mizan al-Hikmah, Man arafa nafsah faqad arafa rabb. The one who knows his nafs, who knows his self, he knows his Lord. And this tradition has been the subject of profound esoteric reflection. The mystics, they love this hadith in particular. But in one of the key aspects in which we're understanding it for tonight's discussion, it is to know that once we have reconciled the rights of the self, once we have understood what we are supposed to do with our bodies in this world, that is when we will use it to complete the right of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we will get to know God and we will attain His salvation. But we can look at it in a simpler context as well, from a different angle. Think about it this way. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's put us in this world and He's given us these bodies not that we own them. They belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And with that comes certain conditions. It's kind of like if you are renting a house or a property. You don't own that place, you can't change it in ways that the owner doesn't allow you. You have to respect it, you have to look after it, and you can only use it for ways that the owner has permitted you to. And it is the same for our body. It doesn't belong to us, it is lent to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so when we talk about the rights of the body, we talk about employing what Allah has lent to us. And this concept of Allah having more rights over us, it is ubiquitous. That's very, very acknowledged, as we spoke about yesterday. Even the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, he has greater rights over ourselves than we have over our own nafs. There's that famous tradition in Ghadir Khum, which is recorded in Sunan Ibn Majah, Kitab al-Khasa'is by An-Nisa'i, and a lot of other great recorders of history and ahadith, that the Holy Prophet, before he took the hand of Imam Ali alayhi salam and said, Man kuntum mawla fahada aliyun mawla, he prefaced it by saying that, is it not true that I have more authority over your own selves than you have? Similarly in the Quran, Surah Al-Ahzab, verse number 6, النبي أولى بالمؤمنين من أنفسهم, that the Prophet is closer to the believers than they are to their very self. So the ultimate goal is to take our nafs and to dissolve it into the will of the divine. That we try and reject the desires of the self in order that we may achieve that resonance with God above. Now some might question, when we look at the word Islam, Islam itself, it means submission. It comes from the same root, from Sin, Lam and Mim, which means underlying peace. But the word Islam itself, it means submission to God. And some may ask, well, your entire life you're going to submit your will to someone else? Is that not backward thinking? Is that not just to give up? Is that not being intellectually lazy? It is actually quite the opposite. Because whenever anybody seeks any value or purpose in life, they look above and beyond themselves. Because again, the human being limited in his own self is just a concoction of atoms, a group of cells, a conglomerate of disconnected parts, the value of which is very little if you were to add up what the components of the human body are. So we need value, something above us. Some people, they find it in honor. Other people find it in love. Other people find it in devotion to their government. But we, rather than seeking anything above us and arbitrary like this, we say, yes, we take it out of ourselves, we put it above us, but we put it as high as is possible. We pin our moral existence and the values of our lives into Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the divine. And thus, when we control ourselves enough, and we take that much power over what our natural desires are, and we want to do one thing, but we say no, for higher values and reasons, I'm going to do something else. That is not backward. That is actually the most forward, the most wonderful and enlightening of methods, as opposed to sheer hedonism or whatever the opposite might have. But what is the self? When we talk about the nafs, what exactly are we talking about? Well, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions the term nafs many times. And He uses it in slightly different ways, but we'll focus on the meaning of the soul. In Surah Al-Zumar, verse number 42, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Allahu yatawaffa al-anfusa hina mawtiha. That Allah takes the souls of the dead and the souls of the living while they sleep. And He holds on to the souls that have been ordained death. And He gives back the souls to those who were just sleeping. And there's a beautiful relation between sleep and death throughout the Quran, throughout Islamic literature and general literature at large. We spoke about it at length a couple years ago when speaking about Ashabul Kahf. But it is the soul that animates the body. For when the soul leaves, even in part, that is when we become unconscious, when we're asleep. And when it leaves permanently, that is when we have died. And the soul represents the essence of the human being, the core down, if you were to crystallize what the human being is at the core level. Because when you look at us as humans, what are you? Our bodies belong to us, but we are not our bodies. Our hand is our hand, but we are not our hand. Our brain is our brain, but we are not our brain. But if you were to crystallize the essence of the human, it is the soul. In the Holy Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse number 48, Allah, when talking about the soul, He says, "Then guard yourselves against a day when one soul will not avail another, nor shall intercession be accepted for it, nor shall compensation be taken from it, nor shall anyone be helped from the outside." We're painted, our souls on this day of judgment, as being in a desolate land, all alone, isolated. Why? Because it is in this context that we have the core of the human being. All of our intentions are exposed. All of the deeds we did in secret, we thought no one was watching, Allah has now shown to us. Even our bodies will bear witness against us on that day to reveal what lies at the core of the human being. But there are different levels to the nafs. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He gives us three basic levels. Nafsul Ammaara bis-su', Nafsul Lawwaama, and Nafsul Muṭmainnah. What are these three levels? The first level, Nafsul Ammaara, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَمَا أُبَرِّئُ نَفْسِي إِنَّ النَّفْسَ لَأَمَّارَةٌ بِالسُّوءِ إِلَّا مَا رَحِمَ رَبِّي إِنَّ رَبِّي غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. He talks about the Nafsul Ammaara, he says in Surah Yusuf, verse number 53, I do not pretend to be blameless, for every man's soul incites him towards evil. Unless my Lord shows him mercy, He is most forgiving, most merciful. Imam Ali, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. He says in Mustadrak al-Wasail, the soul is inclined towards evil deeds, and it is the servant's responsibility that he guides it towards good deeds. And the soul tries to resist, but the servant tries to control the bad desires of the soul. Whenever the servant lets his soul go free and do as it wishes, he is a partner in the corruption and the crimes that it commits. And whoever aids his own soul to fulfill its carnal desires, he has taken part in the killing of himself. When we reject the rights of the nafs and the rights of the body, we are engaging in killing the nafs. In what respect? Because the purpose of our creation is that we attain salvation through service to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as we take the nafs further and further away from Allah, we're taking it further and further away from its purpose. The Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa he is walking past a group of people, and they're surrounding a very muscular man who is picking up large boulders for show. And they marvel at this man, and they come to Rasulullah, they say, Ya Rasulullah, look how strong this man is. And Rasulullah looked at him and said, shall I tell you who is truly strong? The truly strong one is the one who is insulted by others but restrains himself, overcomes his anger, overcomes the devil within himself. That person is stronger than whoever can lift large rocks. The true strength in front of God, the ultimate strength, the one that does not wither as we age, is not the strength of the body, but the strength of the power that we have over the nafs. How much we can control Nafsul Ammaara. And the second level of the nafs is Nafsul Lawwaama. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Qiyamah, وَلَا أُقْسِمُ بِالنَّفْسِ اللَّوَّامَةِ. I do call to witness on the resurrection day the self-reproaching spirit. This refers to the moral conscience, that compass that we have inside of us. That when we're doing something wrong, we know it's wrong and we know that we shouldn't do it. We wrestle with that. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, interestingly, He says in this verse that He calls that nafs to account. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is judging us on the Day of Judgment, one of the items that He uses, one of the instruments of judgment is what? Is your own conscience. Because you knew something was wrong, but we still did it. So how about a demonstrated example of the two? Nafsul Ammaaratun bisu and Nafsul Lawwaama. One of the most beautiful examples of this is portrayed in Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Dostoevsky being probably the most famous Russian novelist who has ever lived. And he writes in what has commonly been said to be the best book ever written about a man called Raskolnikov. And he's a good guy. He tries hard. He's looking after his mother and his sister, or at least he's trying to get into a position where he can support them. So he goes off to university and he tries to study, but he runs into hard times. And he's not able to afford his tuition fees, and he drops out. And he becomes increasingly desperate and poor, and he knows that his family are going closer and closer to destitution. In his community, there is an old lady, an abhorrent person, someone who looks for the weak and the poor, and she preys upon them. She's a pawnbroker. So anybody who has anything they need to sell in a desperate situation, she takes them off them, but she gives them the cheapest price. She exploits them in their desperation. And that's a common practice in the modern world, because sometimes when you say this, when you give this example, people will say, well, oh, it's just supply and demand. I mean, they didn't have to sell their items to the old lady, right? They didn't need to. They went voluntarily and did it. But that was the compulsion of poverty, and she knew it and she exploited it. And there's few crimes that she doesn't commit. And that is one of the worst sins in Islam, is to exploit the needy. Being poor is expensive. This is what people don't always understand. When you can't afford, for example, to pay something all in one go, they give you the option to pay in installments. And what happens? In the end, you have paid far more than if you just paid in the first place. But because of your desperate financial situation, you couldn't do it. May Allah protect us from exploiting the poor. So he thinks about it. This lady is rich. He thinks, what if I killed her and I took her money and used it for good? And a couple of characters are speaking about this as he's walking by. 100,000 good deeds could be done and helped on that old woman's money, which she is in her will, she sends it to a monastery to build. She wants to undo her sins of this world by having a monastery built for her after she dies. She thinks that somehow she can trick God into accidentally sending her to heaven. Hundreds of thousands might be set right on the path, dozens of families saved from destitution and ruin from her money. And with the help, if we kill her and we take her money, with the help of it we devote oneself to the service of humanity, what could we achieve? What could not come if one tiny crime is wiped out by thousands of good deeds? For one life, thousands would be saved from corruption and decay. One death and 100 lives in exchange. It's just simple arithmetic. Besides, what value is the life of that sickly, stupid, ill-natured old woman in the balance of existence? No more than the life of a louse, a black beetle, less in fact because she is doing harm, wearing out the lives of others. This was the logical argument that was put forward. And he goes on to justify it by drawing parallels with the great men of history like Napoleon, who couldn't have accomplished what they did without the spilling of human blood. Very specious logic. But with the logic that he puts forward here, it seems in the moment ironclad. There's no argument that anybody can give that seems to contradict this on a purely logical basis. That is his Nafsul Ammaara, pushing him towards doing something bad. But then there is also Nafsul Lawwaama. There's a moral conscience. Because after hearing this conversation, he goes to sleep. And in his dream, he's a young boy again. Being a boy, it represents his innocence, his youth. And in this dream, he sees that there's a horse that has a cart behind it. And the cruel owner is putting more and more people in the cart. The horse, it's not that strong. And people remark, they say, look, the horse can't take this much weight. And he says, I'll force it to take whatever weight I want. It's my property. And when the horse tries to struggle and move, it can't. He begins to whip it. And over again, every part of it, he begins to whip. And other people join in. They pick up sticks, they pick up various items, they start to beat the horse. And as a child, he says, he ran besides the mare, ran in front of her, saw her being whipped across the eyes, whipped in the eyes. He was crying and choking, and his tears were streaming. The poor boy beside himself made his way screaming through the crowd to the sorrel nag, put his arms around the bleeding dead head and kissed it, kissed the eyes, kissed the lips, and said, oh father, why did they kill the poor horse? And he sobbed, his voice broke down, and the words came in shrieks from his panting chest. In this dream, his moral conscience awakens. No logic could convince him not to kill. But through this internal compass, this Nafsul Lawwaama, he's shown not a logical argument, but a truly experiential one. The two were at odds, and for which one he chose, you can inshallah read the book, it's phenomenal. And the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa he said in Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal's, the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Sunan ibn Majah, that one of the signs of a mu'min is that when he commits a good deed, he feels good inside. And when he commits a bad deed, he feels bad. Again, that is Nafsul Lawwaama at work. But once we support Nafsul Lawwaama and we try and push away Nafsul Ammaratum bis-su', we arrive at something known as Nafsul Muṭmainnah, which is described in the verses that I recited at the beginning. Surah Al-Fajr, verses number 27 to 30. To the righteous souls it would be said, O your soul, O this nafs, in complete rest and inner peace, come back to your Lord well pleased. And so while you are well pleased with your Lord, and your Lord is well pleased with you, satisfaction, enter then among my devotees, enter my paradise. It's a beautiful image being painted here, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opens the gates of paradise and says, you have attained this, please enter in peace. There's a wonderful tradition. A man went to Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. And he asked, well, will it be difficult when we die, when the soul is taken out of the body? Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salam says, you're speaking about a mu'min? He says, yes, about a mu'min, a true mu'min. He said, no. By God, when the angel of death comes to a mu'min when he is dying, initially he is anxious, he is distressed. But the angel tells him, don't be distressed. I swear by God, who appointed the Prophet, that I will be kinder to you than a merciful father were at this moment. Open your eyes and look. And then Prophet Muhammad, Imam Ali, Bibi Fatima, Imam al-Hassan, Imam al-Hussein, and all of the Imams will come forward to meet him. It is said to him that here are your Imams. He opens his eyes and he sees them call him into the paradise. O Nafsul Muṭmainnah, who has achieved peace through Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Return to your Lord with the friendship of Ali and the reward of your Lord. Join my servants Muhammad and his Ahlul Bayt and enter my paradise. And at that moment, nothing will be more beloved to the person who's dying than for his soul to be taken out of this imperfect world and set amongst the stars. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So the right of the self, in summary, is to support Nafsul Lawwaama, to push away Nafsul Ammaara, and to attain Nafsul Muṭmainnah. And perfection, it lies at the rejection of the basal self. This is what the Urafah talk about when they say the ultimate goal in life isn't actually Jannah. Jannah is a high goal, but the goal above that is to attain God himself, to lose the self in the ocean of the divine. A man asks the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he says, O Prophet of God, what is the way to recognize God? He says, recognize the self. What is the way to agree with God? To disagree with the self. What is the way to please God? To displease the self. What is the way to approach God? To abandon the desires of the self. What is the way to obey God? To disobey the desires of the self. What is the way to remember God? By fighting the self. What is the way to get closer to God? By going away from the self. What is the way to get accustomed to God, to fear the self? What is the way to attain all this? To seek God's help against yourself.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
This is in Wasa'ul al-Shia. And in order to do that, so Imam, he starts by saying the right of the self is obedience, and through that we get salvation. But then he goes through the body, the instruments that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, and he tells us how we respect their individual rights. And there are a number of different parts of the body he mentions, but we'll go through 4 of them, inshallah. And he starts off with the right of the tongue, and the most important of the rights of the body. He says, in Rasalatul Huquq, the right of the tongue is that you consider it too noble for obscenity. Accustom it to good and refrain from meddling in something where there is nothing to be gained. Express kindness to the people and speak well concerning them. In that small paragraph, he gives us some of the most beautiful ways in which we use the tongue in the way of Islam. The power of speech, it is a divine gift. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says in Surah Al-Rahman, عَلَّمَهُ الْبَيَانِ, that Allah taught us how to speak. In the 4th verse of Surah Al-Rahman, where he's talking about his great blessings and virtues. He even uses it as a sign in Surah Al-Rum, verse 22. Our languages, our different tongues, they are a sign of God. And if nothing else, if we have no other recourse to good deeds, the Holy Prophet, he said, look after your tongue. There was a man who asked Rasulullah that give me the keys to paradise. Rasulullah, he says, if you want it in summary, feed the hungry, quench the thirst of the thirsty, do amr bil ma'ruf, encourage people to good, and forbid the evil. Nahi anil munkar. But if you can't do all that, if that is very difficult, then at the very least, guard your tongue from that which is not good. And it's a common theme. There's a wonderful biblical verse actually on this topic in James 1:26. Those who consider themselves religious but do not keep a tight rein on their tongue, they deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Before we use the tongue, it's essential to reflect. The Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa when describing the use of the tongue, he says there's a difference between the mu'min and the hypocrite. And the cardinal difference lies in what the mu'min gives priority. If he puts his tongue in front of his heart, so that the tongue speaks before the heart considers, he is a munafiq, the one who doesn't think before he speaks. But if he puts his tongue behind his heart, that the tongue asks for permission from the heart before speaking, that is to say, we think carefully before we speak, that is the sign of a mu'min. And why are the rights of the tongue so high? Because the tongue, it is a doorway. It's a window that you look into the true person beneath. Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, he says in a tradition in Muntaha al-Amal, that man is hidden under his tongue. Sometimes we say, though the person, he's a good person, he just doesn't have control over his tongue. That's not quite true. That's not how it works. If somebody is truly good, then it is reflected in the tongue, because again, the tongue, it's only a window. If someone purifies themselves, then when that window opens via the tongue, you see goodness, as opposed to badness and ugliness. And Imam Ali salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, he says a wonderful hadith. He says about the tongue, he says, جِرْمُهُ صَغِيرٌ وَجُرْمُهُ ثَقِيلٌ. That its weight, its mass is very light, but its weight, its impact is so great. There's a stark difference. We don't always give that much consideration to the tongue. So what does Imam say? He says that your tongue should be too noble for obscenity. Respect your tongue. That same tongue that you use to say the names of Ahlul Bayt, the same tongue you use to recite the Holy Quran, the same tongue that you use to converse with your loved ones. Don't dirty it. Don't sully it by saying bad words. Don't lose control. There's a hadith from the Holy Prophet. He says, beware of swearing, because God does not like swearing or those who are used to swearing, especially amongst the youth. when we're younger, we want to be different, right? We have this desire to break the rules of our elders in order to try and raise our respect, to try and make us feel like we're worth more than what we are. But what we don't realize is, number one, first of all, it doesn't look good. And number two, it does the opposite. When we swear, we are showing that we don't have control over the tongue, that we are recoursing to those primitive parts of the brain. Because often when we swear, it actually comes from a neurological level, it comes from a different place to where your standard speech comes. It comes from a much further back path down the evolutionary pathway regarding calls and warnings, as opposed to normal complex speech. So number one, protect it from obscenity. Number two, accustom it to good. And it's amazing that when you raise kids, when children are going through their formative years, they pick up things and they absorb things that you don't always realize. There was one line in a movie that I watched when I was a child. It was called Bambi, a Disney movie. 1942 it came out, believe it or not. And there's a character in there called Thumper, and he's a young rabbit, and he says one of the most marvelous lines of wisdom regarding the tongue. He says, if you can't say something nice, don't say nothing at all. That again, we put that tongue behind the heart, and the heart does the assessment. Is what I am about to say, is it good? If not, then let's follow the sunnah of Thumper. And it lies within the very definition of a mu'min. The Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
He says, a servant's faith is only when his heart is directed towards God. And his heart is only directed towards God when his tongue is on the straight path. A man whose neighbor is not safe from his harmful conduct will not enter paradise. You want to know one of the definitions of a mu'min? Think, are you safe when you leave the room? Will they say something bad? Will they spread fasad? Will they plant their ideas? Or will they consider you and your best interests? If they do the latter, then most likely they are a mu'min. And there's a verse in the Holy Quran, Surah Al-Hujurat, verse number 11. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He extols us, He tells us to do good deeds with the tongue. He says, O you who believe, let not some men amongst you laugh at others. It might be that the ones you're laughing at are better than you. Nor let some women laugh at others, for it may be that the ones being laughed at are better than the laughers. Nor defame or be derisorily sarcastic to one another, nor call each other by offensive nicknames, ill-seeming as connoting wickedness. After one has believed, if you persist in this, you are doing wrong. We can never underestimate the power of the words. This is why Imam is telling us one of the rights of the tongue is that we accustom it to good. Continuously expose it to goodness and refrain from the badness. Because we don't always understand the impact of the words that we say. Take a joke, for example. Right? Everybody has this desire to be funny, or at least most people, because it makes them center of attention. Sometimes, when you're in a situation, you see the opportunity to get laughs out of the crowd by putting someone down. You think by preying on someone's weakness or on some problem that they have, when you draw attention to that, it's funny. And you might get a few moments of mirth. People might laugh together. But never underestimate about how deeply it might cut the person who's on the receiving end. You don't know what's behind the facade. You don't know what their life experience is. You don't know what their insecurities are. You don't know what difficulties they've gone through. What you think is funny is over in a few moments, but for them they bear this burden now for weeks to come. And sometimes they're haunted by it. It rules their mental health. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala advises us to be careful. Imam goes on to say, refrain from meddling in which there is nothing to be gained. The Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he says, one of the signs of excellence of a mu'min and his submission to God is leaving what does not concern him. Again, it's hard. We want to be involved. If someone's talking about something, we want to voice our opinion, even if we have no substance behind the opinion that we have. Or we want to learn about what is happening in other people's lives. But we have enough going on. Life is difficult enough as it is. We've got enough of our own concerns. Why bother trying to put our tendrils into the affairs of others? especially when we realize that we're told specifically that it violates the rights of the tongue. Imam goes on to say, express kindness to the people and speak well concerning them. We speak good things. And this is one of the beautiful pragmatic benefits of Islam. That Islam, aside from its veracity, it teaches us to be good people in all senses of the term. Speak good of people, don't speak ill. When you do this, and you do it in public and people see you doing it, it creates an aura of goodness around you. And people are attracted to that, especially in a world as fake as our own. And when we follow these rights of the body, which most people don't, we have that divine radiance that attracts people like moths to a flame, even if they can't explain why. And finally, of the rights of the tongue, never lie. For lying is a sign of kufr. In Surah An-Nahl, verse 105, إِنَّمَا يَفْتَرِ الْكَذِبَ الَّذِينَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ بِآيَاتِ اللَّهِ وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْكَاذِبُونَ. Falsehood is fabricated only by those who do not believe in Allah's revelation. They are most surely the liars. If we lie and we try and twist reality in order to fit what our whims are, then we are denying the very revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's cowardice. We are afraid of facing the truth. So we create an alternative reality to try and escape the consequences of whatever's happening. And it is the gateway to all sins. Imam al-Askari, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi,
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
He says in Mustadrak al-Wasail that all wickedness, all sin is contained in one room, and that room is unlocked by the key of lying. It is the gateway. Imagine, what sin other than lying? It enables all other sins. Why? Because it allows you to get away with it. If you constantly told people, oh yeah, I just did this sin, people would look it down and be, why are you doing that? But once we lie and we weave these veils of deception in front of us, it permits more and more to happen. And lies build up like dead wood until eventually they catch up with us and they are ablaze. Because you only have to remember one version of the truth, but there are an infinite number of lies. Briefly, that is the right of the tongue. Now, what of the right of hearing? Imam, he says, the right of hearing is to keep it pure from listening to backbiting and from listening to that which is unlawful. In Tuhaf al-Uqul, where slightly more detail is given on the rights, he says, indeed, hearing is the gateway through which various concepts reach the heart, whether good or evil. And there is no power except in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The rights of the ear are profound. And Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam,
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
he puts the rights of the ear before he talks about the rights of the eye. Why? Because the ear, it is a gateway into the soul. We read in Surah Al-Mulk, verse number 23, قُلْ هُوَ الَّذِي أَنشَأَكُمْ وَجَعَلَ لَكُمُ السَّمْعَ وَالْأَبْصَارَ وَالْأَفْئِدَةَ قَلِيلًا مَا تَشْكُرُونَ. Say, it is He who brought you into being and who endowed you with hearing and sight and understanding. What small thanks you give. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also talks about hearing before He talks about sight. And through the use of hearing, we take information in and we consider it, we're supposed to digest it. Imam Ali alayhi salam, he says in Usul al-Kafi, O questioner, listen first, then understand, then believe, then act upon what you have heard. 3 times he emphasizes the fact that we absorb and digest first before we speak. Again, it goes back to the interlinked nature between the rights of the tongue and the rights of the ear. We keep the tongue behind the heart. Imam starts by saying, keep it pure from listening to backbiting. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He uses the analogy in Surah Al-Hujurat, verse number 12, that would you like to eat the flesh of your dead brother? One of the most graphic examples in the Holy Quran. In order to try and draw attention to how heinous an act this is. Because in their absence, they cannot defend themselves. And it is cowardly, just like lying. And sometimes people, they try and make things ambiguous. They say, oh, I'm not sure if it's ghiba. Maybe it's ghiba, maybe it's not. Allahu a'lam. No. There's a litmus test. Hazrat Abu Dhal al-Ghafari, he was asked about ghiba. And he said it's very simple. What's the litmus test? Ask yourself one question. If that person was here who you're talking about, would they be happy with what you're saying, or would they be upset with what you're saying? If they would be upset, if they don't want you to say it, then no, that falls in the category of ghiba. And if they don't mind, or if they like it, then that's fine. Here we're talking, of course, about frivolous talk. Sometimes there are certain conditions where information exchange is very, very important. Imam goes on to say, then also protect your hearing from listening to that which is unlawful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, Surah Al-Luqman, verse number 6, and of men is he who takes instead frivolous discourse to lead astray from Allah's path without knowledge, to take it for a mockery, they shall have an abasing chastisement. And the Mufassirin and countless ahadith, they look at this term, frivolous discourse, and they say it refers to haram music. When we listen to haram music, we open again that door into our heart. And what is the effect? In the next verse, and when our communications are recited to him, he turns back proudly as if he has not heard them, as though his ears were in a heaviness, therefore announce to him a painful chastisement. Why is listening to haram music so bad? Why is there so much Quranic and Sunnah emphasis put on it? Because again, the ear, it is the window to the soul. When you hear something, particularly in an emotional state, which is what a lot of music deliberately tries to evoke, there's an escapism to a lot of music. When we listen to things in that state, it pierces deep down into our heart, far deep down into our subconscious as well. We think, oh, no, I know this is wrong, right? Logically, I know it's wrong. Sure, if you were to discuss it on a logical perspective, fine, but the ears often skip that. And when you look at a lot of what is published in music today, what does it do? It normalizes all sorts of concepts which are antithetical to Islam. It normalizes lust, for example, and haram relationships. There's a lot of talk of alcohol, a lot of obscenities, a lot of swearing, a lot of talk of drugs. So many inappropriate things, so many immodesties and haram come from that. And if we listen to music, we open up our hearts for that, and Allah warns us, when you do that, you will become numb to the communications of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
There was a man called Bishr al-Hafi. The Imam was walking past his house and he heard music was coming out of it. At that time, a servant from the house was throwing out some garbage. So the Imam asked the servant, is the owner of the house a free man or a slave? And she said, he's a free man. And Imam said, indeed, I thought so. For if he was a slave, he would have recognized the authority of his master, referring to Allah. When the message got to Bishr that the Imam had said this, he ran out of his house with such haste, he didn't even have time to put on his shoes. That's why he's called Al-Hafi, the barefooted one. And he begged for forgiveness and reformation. Because when we open the door to music, we invite all the other harams in as well. There was alcohol in the house, there were other immoralities going on, but the Imam knew it. How? Simply by knowing that there was music there. That is the right of hearing, the right of sight. Imam says, the right of sight is that you lower it before everything which is unlawful, and you take heed of whatever you look at. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He uses sight as an example, as one of the signs of His creation. Surah Al-Nahl, verse 78. And in Surah Al-Balad, verse number 8, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks rhetorically, have we not made for him a pair of eyes? And about that in Nur al-Thaqalain, the Holy Prophet, he says, O children of Adam, this is a hadith Qudsi, Allah says to the children of Adam, I have given you two lips. If your tongue tries to make you commit a forbidden act, close the two lips. And O children of Banu Adam, I have given you two pairs of eyelids. If any haram comes your way, you close the eyes. He's made it easy for us. How small the movement is in order to avoid sin, but how difficult it sometimes comes for us. And we lower the gaze before that which is unlawful, that which is haram. And Allah, He goes into detail about this in Surah An-Nur, verse number 30. He talks about the hijab of the eyes, both of men and of women. And one of the major problems that people struggle with in the modern world, especially amongst the youth, is the issue with accessing haram through their eyes. Access to the internet, various digital devices, subverting parental controls, it's very, very common. And what people don't tend to realize, especially when you're younger, one thing you don't appreciate is that, yes, there is a spiritual consequence, and we've sort of been speaking about that as we went along. But there's also a physical consequence as well, because there are various axes in the body which are delicately balanced. They respond to certain stimuli, and you get the appropriate response physiologically. But if you overload the system, if you look at so much haram, you break the axis and you increase the threshold, because the body wants equilibrium. The threshold increases and increases and increases to unrealistic standards. And then there are physical dysfunctions as well that happen as a result. Islam gave us the answer to a lot of problems before they even came our way. Such is the importance of looking after the eye. And the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he says that every eye will weep on the day of judgment except three. The eye that wept out of the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the eye that passed the sleepless night for the sake of Allah, and the eye that looked away when it was exposed to haram. So much reward from this control. And take heed of whatever you look at. The Imam goes on, that when we look at things, we try and reflect, and we look at the goodness therein. And there are lots of ahadith that talk about the benefits of the eye and how much we reflect. There's a beautiful aspect of the rights of the eye, that it gives us both sight, and also through it, when we respect its rights, it gives us the power of reflection. And there's a wisdom behind these rights, that when we follow these rights, when we respect the rights of the body, and we understand them on a deeper level, we follow them not just because we were told to, not just because we're commanded to, or our parents are making us, but when we really appreciate, we get down to the details, and we recognize that every prohibition is for a reason. Every limit, every right has its effects. We recognize that they all have effects on us. For example, listening to haram, we recognize that it inculcates bad values into our heart. When we look at haram, it numbs us to looking at the majesty of creation. When we use the ears or the eyes or the tongue or any aspect of the body against the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we harm ourselves both spiritually and physically. The cost is too great to encounter. Such is the rights of the eye. And finally, the rights of the stomach. Now, again, there are far more body parts that the Imam talks about. Over these nights, we're going to be taking a small sampling of them to give us an understanding of what the Imam is providing us here. And inshallah, in our own time, we can go and read some more. The right of your stomach is that you make it not into a container for that which is haram for you, unlawful for you, and you eat no more than your fill. Eating no more than our fill, that is perhaps the most important piece of wisdom when it comes to health in the modern world. There was a study published in The Lancet in 2016, and it mentioned the fact that there are more obese people now in the world than there are underweight. Let that sink in for a moment. How desperately wrong has the world gone for that to be the case? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us in Surah 7 verse 31, وَكُلُوا وَاشْرُبُوا وَلَا تُسْرِفُوا. Eat and drink, but not to excess. The Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he says in Surah At-Tirmidhi, the human does not fill any receptacle worse than his stomach. It is sufficient for the son of Adam to eat such that he keeps himself alive. But if this is too difficult, then 1/3 for food, 1/3 for water, and 1/3 empty. Again, Islam has given us the solution to so many modern problems. If only we obeyed them before, if only we followed these solutions before they became problems. Islam is the religion of moderation. And do not make it into a container that is haram, for haramness. In Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 168, Allah says, O mankind, eat from whatever is on the earth that is lawful, that is halal and good, and do not follow in the footsteps of shaitan. The Holy Prophet, he tells us in a tradition that when we eat one morsel of haram, the angels, they come and they send their la'na, they send their curses from the skies and from the earth upon us for eating that morsel of haram. And if we eat halal, we actually get rewarded for it, because the angels, they instead come from the skies and from the earth and they pray for our forgiveness until we finish eating. But remember, eating halal is not just eating that which was slaughtered in the correct way, but also it is making sure that whatever we eat comes from halal means as well, from halal money. When we earn our money in a haram way, when we're doing things which are unethical, and then we use that money in order to buy food, that food itself becomes haram, just like everything else that we do with that money. And it has a spiritual effect. When we consume haram, or when we disobey any of the rights of the body, it has consequences. When we eat haram, it hardens the heart, it covers the soul, and it blackens our conscience. Imam Hussein alayhi salam, when he stands in Karbala and he is admonishing the opposition, what does he say in Nafsul Mahmum? He says, your bellies are filled with haram. Now how can you accept the truth?